Assembling of S-AMT transmission assembly. Precautions for assembling transmission. 1. Clean all parts of the transmission before assembling the transmission. 2. Prepare necessary assembly tools, special tools, grease, thread seal tape, thread locking adhesive, plain sealant, etc. before assembly. 3. Handle parts with care when assembling to avoid bumping. 4. Pay attention to the magnitude of the force applied to the parts during the assembly of the parts, and do not knock violently to avoid damage to the parts. 5. Use special tools for the transmission to assemble, and strictly adhere to all adjustment data and tightening torques in this video. 1. Assembling of auxiliary transmission assembly. 1. Install the inner ring gear and ring gear carrier assembly on the planetary mechanism assembly. 2. Install the spacer with the opening groove facing upwards. 3. Install the low gear cone hub assembly and apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease on the outer cone. Then install the synchronizer ring. 4. Install the synchronizer gear seat. Make sure that the opening groove faces downwards, and let the synchronizer ring boss engage with the gear seat recesses. 5. Install the circlip with circlip pliers. 6. Install the sliding sleeve and make sure that the sliding sleeve recesses must line up with the gear seat's recesses during installation. 7. Install 9 synchronizer thrust pieces, inner and outer springs of the thrust pieces into the synchronizer recesses, and paying attention to the installation direction of the thrust pieces. (8) Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the inner cone of the synchronizer ring and install the synchronizer ring. 9. Use a punch to install the high gear cone hub in place, and make sure that the wide groove of the high gear cone hub is aligned with the upper oil hole of the output shaft. (10) Install the fork sliding pads into the range fork hole, and then locate the fork sliding pads into the sliding sleeve. 11. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the depth from the plane of the output shaft rear end cover to the inner end face at 3 points, and take the average value as A. 12. Place the bearing on the oil guide ring. Measure the height from the bearing outer ring to the oil guide ring with a digital depth gauge at 3 points, and take the average value as B. 13. Use a vernier caliper to measure the thickness of the rear housing at 3 points and take the average value as C. 14. The thickness of the gasket is 0.4 millimeters, denoted as D. The axial clearance shall be 0 millimeters is or less than A plus D minus parenthesis B minus C close parenthesis, minus x equals to or smaller than 0.1 mm x, where x is the thickness of the selected adjustment shim. 15. Install the oil guide ring and apply an appropriate amount of 5699 sealant to the bolt hole without interruption. 16. Use a punch to install the bearing, sensor ring gear, and spacer in place. Install the rear housing and pay attention to aligning the fork shaft. (17) Install the O-ring, gasket, and output shaft rear end cover. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and pay attention to installing the perforated bolts near the odometer. Tighten the bolts to 50 ± 5 Nm with 13 mm and 16 mm sockets. (18) Install the output flange in place. (19) Apply 5699 sealant along the joint surface of the flange and output shaft. Install the pressing plate, align the roller needle, and make sure that the locking groove of the pressure plate is facing upwards. 20. Tighten the large bolt to 1260 ± 10% Nm with a 60 mm socket. Install the locking plate and rivet the lock with a chisel. (21) Install the piston. Apply an appropriate amount of 263 thread locking adhesive to the nut with position sensor pin rod and tighten it to 119 to 145 Nm with a 24 mm wrench. 22. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the cavity of the range gear cylinder and install the cylinder. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolt and tighten the bolt to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 23. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the thread of the odometer sensor and tighten it to 41 to 49 Nm. Install the output shaft speed sensor. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolt and tighten it to 12 ± 3 Nm with a 10 mm socket. 24. Assemble the forward torsion shafts in place. (2) Assembling of input shaft assembly. 1. Mark any tube of the constant driving gear low with a marker spaced by 180 degrees and mark the symmetrical tube with a marker. 2. Invert the input shaft with the front end facing upwards and install the constant driving gear low. 3. Install the input shaft bearing with tooling and note that the ring groove of the bearing shall face upwards. 4. Install the circlip with circlip pliers. 5. Turn over the input shaft with the front end facing downwards. Install the cone hub. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the outer cone of the cone hub. And then install the synchronizing ring. 6. Install the synchronizer gear seat. Align the synchronizer ring boss with the recesses of the gear seat and use circlip pliers to install the circlip. 7. Install the synchronizer sliding sleeve and make sure that the sliding sleeve's recesses must line up with the gear seat's recesses during installation. 8. Install 3 synchronizer thrust pieces, inner and outer springs into the synchronizer recesses, and paying attention to the installation direction of the thrust pieces. 9. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the inner cone of the synchronizer ring and install the cone hub. 10. Install washer, large thrust bearing, and constant driving gears high in sequence. 11. Install the large thrust bearing, needle bearing, thrust bearing race, and securing ring assembly, small thrust bearing, and washer in sequence. 12. Apply an appropriate amount of 263 thread locking adhesive to the locating nut. Tighten the nut to 120 plus-minus 10% Newton meters with a 36 mm socket and rivet it with a chisel. 3. Assembling of main shaft assembly. 1. Use pliers to contract the securing ring. Install it to the main shaft and slightly lifting the main shaft to verify whether the securing ring is properly engaged. 2. Install the main shaft sliding sleeve and keep the wide groove to be aligned with the keyway of the main shaft. 3. Install the main shaft gear spacer, turn by half a tooth, and align the wide groove with the keyway. 4. Install the main shaft third gear and main shaft gear spacer and turn by half a tooth. 5. Install the main shaft second gear and main shaft gear spacer and turn by half a tooth. 6. Install the main shaft sliding sleeve and the main shaft gear spacer and turn by half a tooth. 7. Install the main shaft first gear and main shaft gear spacer and turn by half a tooth. 8. Install the main shaft reverse gear and main shaft gear spacer and turn by half a tooth. 9. Install the hex key and reverse gear sliding sleeve. 4. Timing procedures. 1. Find the teeth alignment marking points for the custom meshing gears of the left and right countershaft assemblies, and clearly mark the two teeth with a marker. 2. Engage the marked teeth on both sides of the custom driving gear low into the grooves of the marked teeth on the left and right countershafts. 3. Place the split fork shaft assembly and fork sliding pads. The third and fourth fork shaft assembly. The first, second fork shaft assembly, and the reverse fork shaft assembly in sequence. 5. The third and fourth fork shaft assembly. 1. Lift the shaft package as a whole with tooling and install it into the front housing to ensure that the bearing and fork shaft fall into the corresponding holes in the front housing. 2. Install the transmission inner tube 1. Pay attention to the installation direction and apply an appropriate amount of 5699 sealant to the upper part of the front housing without interruption. 3. Place the needle bearing into the idler hole and install washers in the left and right idler hole positions of the middle housing, close to the middle housing. 4. Lift the middle housing, assemble it in place. And tighten the connecting nuts between the middle housing and the front housing to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm wrench. 5. Adjust the position of the idler. Install the left idler shaft with its oil hole towards the locking plate support pin, and install the right idler shaft with its oil hole horizontal, and align the idler shaft with a transmission inner tube 1 with the help of the guide rod. 6. Install the left and right idler shaft pressing plates. Apply 263 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 7. Install the input shaft speed sensor. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolt and tighten it to 12 ± 3 Nm with a 10 mm socket. 8. Fit the spline sleeve onto the main shaft. Pay attention to the position of the hex key and install the sun gear. 9. Apply sufficient lubricating grease to the needle position of the needle bearing and install the transmission inner tube. 10. Apply an appropriate amount of 5699 sealant to the upper part of the middle housing without interruption. Lift the auxiliary transmission assembly and slowly lower it to assemble it in place. 11. Tighten the connecting bolts between the rear and middle housings to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 12. Install the split gear cylinder piston. Apply an appropriate amount of 263 thread locking adhesive to the nut with precision sensor pin rod assembly and tighten it to 119 to 145 Nm with a 24 mm wrench. 13. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the split gear cylinder and install it in place. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 14. Install the steel ball and spring in sequence. Apply an appropriate amount of 263 thread locking adhesive to the hexagon socket bolt and tighten them to 65 plus minus 10% Nm with an 8 mm hex socket driver. 15. Install the filter screen, O-ring, and screen end cover. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 25 plus minus 2 Nm with a 13 mm socket. Wrap the oil drain plug. Note that this is a strong magnetic plug with red seal tape and tighten it to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 17 mm socket. 6. Assembling of accessories inside front housing. 1. Use circular pliers to install the stop rings of the input shaft bearing, left and right countershaft bearing. 2. With the front housing of the transmission facing upwards, gently tap the input shaft, left and right countershafts with a copper bar to make the stop ring fit closely with the front housing and ensure it is installed in place. 3. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the height from the plane of the left countershaft bearing outer raise to the end face of front housing. At 3 points, take the average value and record it as a 1. 4. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the depth from the end face of the oil pump to the inner face at 3 points. Take the average value and record it as B1. 5. The thickness of the gasket is 0.4 mm, denoted as C1. 6. The axial clearance of the left countershaft shall be 0 mm, equals to or smaller than B1 plus C1 minus A1 minus X1 equals to or smaller than 0.1 mm, where X1 is the thickness of the selected shim. 7. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the height from the plane of the right countershaft bearing outer raise to the end face of front housing. At 3 points, take the average value and record it as a 2. 8. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the depth from the end face of the end cover assembly to the inner surface. At 3 points, take the average value and record it as B2. 9. The thickness of the gasket is 0.4 mm. denoted as C2 for right countershaft. 10. The axial clearance of the right countershaft shall be 0 mm equals to or smaller than B2 plus C2 minus A2 minus X2 smaller than or equals to 0.1 mm, where X2 is the thickness of the selected shim. 11. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the height from the input shaft bearing outer race to the end face of front housing at 3 points. Take the average value and record it as A3. 12. Use a digital depth gauge to measure the depth from the end face of the input shaft end cover to the inner side at 3 points. Take the average value and record it as B3. 13. The thickness of the gasket is 0.4 mm, denoted as C3 for input shaft. 14. The axial clearance of the input shaft shall be 0 mm smaller than or equals to B3 plus C3 minus A3 minus X3 smaller than or equals to 0.1 mm, where X3 is the thickness of the selected shim. 15. Install the oil pump gasket and oil inlet pipe gasket. Install the oil pump assembly. Align the flat key of the rotor inside the oil pump with a left countershaft spline groove. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 16. Install the input shaft end cover. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolt and tighten it to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 17. Install the end cover assembly. Brake pad, brake friction plate, 2 brake pads. Brake friction plate. Pay attention to aligning with the oil hole of the first friction pad. Brake pad, spring, and lifting pin in sequence. 18. Install a sealing ring on the upper part of the piston. Pay attention to the direction of the lip. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease on the inner wall of the cylinder and install the piston. 19. Install the cylinder assembly. Pay attention to the position of the lifting pin. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. Install the hollow bolts of the air pipe and tighten them to 25 plus minus 2 Nm with a 17 mm socket. 20. Install the oil pipe assembly. Tighten the hollow bolts to 50 plus minus 5 Nm with a 22 mm socket. And tighten the hollow bolt of TB brake oil pipe to 25 plus minus 2 Nm with a 14 mm socket. 21. Install the fork shaft bracket and fork assembly. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts. Tighten them to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. And install the grease nozzle assembly with an 11 mm wrench. #7. Installation of XY actuator. 1. Install the gasket and adapter plate. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 50 ± 5 Nm with an 8 mm hexagon socket. 2. Install the gasket, XY actuator, and bracket. Apply an appropriate amount of 243 thread locking adhesive to the bolts and tighten them to 25 ± 2 Nm with a 13 mm socket. 8. Installation of air pipe and harness. 1. Use a 19 mm wrench to install the split gear cylinder air pipe, range gear cylinder air pipe, gear selector and shift air pipes, PCA and TB brake air pipes in sequence, and tighten them to 17 ± 10% Nm. Use a 17 mm socket to install the solenoid valve to connect the air pipes. 2. Use a 16 mm socket to install the harness bracket bolt and tighten it to 50 ± 5 Nm. Insert the harness connector into each actuator properly. And tie the harness with straps. 9. Installation of PTO assembly. 1. Install the spline shaft assembly into the rear housing. 2. Install the O-ring oil return gasket and end cover gasket. 3. Install the front housing of the PTO. Tighten the M12 bolts to 90 ± 9 Nm with an 18 mm socket, and tighten the M10 bolts to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 4. Apply 5699 sealant to the front housing of the PTO without interruption. Install the PTO assembly and tighten it to 50 ± 5 Nm with a 16 mm socket. 5. Install the auxiliary transmission oil inlet pipe and PTO oil pipe. The hollow bolt at large end shall be tightened to 50 ± 5 Nm, and the hollow bolt at small end shall be tightened to 25 ± 2 Nm. 10. Installation of retarder assembly. 1. Apply an appropriate amount of lubricating grease to the retarder O-ring. 2. Lifted retarder assembly. Align the bolt holes and assemble them in place. 3. Screw in 5 bolts and nuts and tighten them to 120 ± 10% Newton-meters with 21 mm and 22 mm wrenches.